Atlantis is usually imagined as a lost paradise under the sea. But in Plato's own story, Atlantis is rich, beautiful, violent, imperial, and morally rotten. It is not introduced as a treasure, it is introduced as a warning. Everybody knows Atlantis, more or less. A glittering city, a lost island, a civilization swallowed by the sea. That is the version modern culture remembers. But it is not the strangest version. The strangest version is the original one. In Plato's dialogues Timaeus and Critias, Atlantis is not introduced as a peaceful paradise that deserved to be found again. It is introduced as a massive royal power outside the Pillars of Heracles, rich beyond imagination, built in concentric rings of land and sea, ruled by kings descended from Poseidon, and strong enough to threaten the ancient Mediterranean. Then the story turns. Atlantis becomes aggressive. Its rulers are corrupted by wealth. Its empire tries to dominate the lands inside the strait. Ancient Athens, in Plato's telling, stands against it. Then earthquakes and flood destroy the island in a single terrible day and night. That is the reversal. Modern people search for Atlantis like it was a treasure. Plato describes it like a warning. So this episode is not another claim that Atlantis has been found. It is not a map hunt. It is not a secret coordinate. It is the Atlantis story most people have never actually heard. The empire, the ritual, the war, the corruption, and the reason the most famous lost city in the world may never have been meant to be a city you could dig up at all. The first thing to know is brutally simple. Every serious Atlantis discussion has to pass through Plato. Not through a satellite image, not through a mysterious underwater shape, not through a travel documentary. Through two 4th century BCE dialogues, Timaeus and Critias. That matters because Plato is not writing a modern field report. He is a philosopher staging a conversation. The story is given a chain of transmission. Critias says Solon heard it from Egyptian priests at Sais. The priests supposedly had older records. Solon carried the tale back, and it moved through family memory until Critias retells it. That chain gives the story ancient atmosphere. It makes Atlantis feel like a memory rescued from deep time. But the setting also warns us to be careful. Plato is using the story inside a discussion about ideal cities, law, virtue, and political order. Atlantis is not dropped into the text as a tourist destination. It is introduced as the opposite force against which ancient Athens can be tested. This is why the usual internet question can be misleading. If the first question is only, where was Atlantis? We may miss what Atlantis does inside the story. It functions like a mirror. It shows what happens when wealth, naval power, divine ancestry, and imperial ambition all gather in one state. The result is not a utopia. It is a civilization impressive enough to fascinate you and dangerous enough to become the villain. Plato knew how to make an image stick. Atlantis is not described as a normal city. Its capital is built around rings. There are circles of seawater and circles of land around a central island. Bridges connect them. A canal runs from the sea into the outer ring so large ships can enter. The city has harbors, dockyards, towers, gates, walls, and passages where triremes can pass through. Even before the moral part of the story begins, the visual design is unforgettable. That may be one reason Atlantis survived for so long. The city is easy to imagine. A target-shaped metropolis in the ocean, part palace, part harbor, part sacred machine. Then Plato adds color. The stone is white, black, and red. Walls are covered with metals. The inner sacred area gleams with aurichalk, a legendary metal with a fiery shine. At the center is a sanctuary connected with Poseidon and Plato, the mythical ancestors of the royal line. This is where a viral Atlantis video can easily go wrong. If we only show beauty, we accidentally repeat the modern fantasy. We make Atlantis look like a place the viewer wants to live. But in the original story, the beauty is bait. The ring city is impressive because power is impressive. Wealth is impressive. Scale is impressive. Harbors full of ships are impressive. And that is exactly the point. Atlantis is not frightening because it looks ruined. Atlantis is frightening because before it falls, it works. The part people forget is the empire. Atlantis is not only an island, it rules other islands, it rules parts of a continent. In Timaeus, the power of Atlantis extends inside the strait across territory in Africa and Europe. Then the story becomes openly political. The Atlantean force tries to enslave the lands inside the Pillars of Heracles. That is not a small detail. It changes the emotional frame of the whole myth. If Atlantis is only a lost city, then its destruction feels like tragedy, a wonder of the world vanished, a mystery left behind. But if Atlantis is a conquering empire, the destruction becomes part of a moral story. Plato's Athens is not fighting a random island. It is standing against a superpower in the story. Others give up or are already enslaved, and Athens has to stand alone before extreme danger. That is the underexplored angle. Atlantis is not the hero of its own legend. Atlantis is the empire at the gate. This also explains why the story still hits. It combines two instincts viewers cannot resist: the desire to discover a lost world, and the fear that a rich civilization can become monstrous when it mistakes power for virtue. Atlantis is beautiful. Atlantis is advanced. Atlantis is dangerous. Then Critias gives a detail that feels almost too cinematic to be real. The rulers of Atlantis are 10 kings. They gather at intervals in the sanctuary of Poseidon on the central island of the ring city. There is a pillar of orichalc with laws and an oath written on it. Before judgment, the kings perform a ritual. There are bulls roaming free in the sanctuary. The kings pray that the god will choose a pleasing victim. Then, without iron weapons, they hunt a bull with ropes and wooden weapons. The captured bull is brought to the pillar. Its throat is cut over the inscription. The law is drenched in blood. That is not a modern conspiracy detail. That is in the ancient literary description. And it completely changes the texture of Atlantis. This is not just turquoise water and shining towers. It is a royal oath ceremony in the dark, with blood, fire, gold vessels, purple robes, judgment, and curses against disobedience. For a viewer who thinks Atlantis is basically an underwater resort, this is the shock detail. Plato's Atlantis has sacred violence at its political center. The kings do not merely live in luxury, they bind themselves to law with ritual force. The island is not just beautiful. It is ceremonial, hierarchical, armed, sacred, dangerous. Critias does not say Atlantis was always wicked. That is another detail worth keeping. At first, the Atlanteans are described as obedient to law, close to their divine ancestry, and not overwhelmed by wealth. They possess gold and other riches, but they treat them lightly. Then their nature changes. The divine element fades as it is mixed again and again with mortality. Their human character becomes dominant. They can no longer bear their possessions, their behavior deteriorates. They seem glorious to people who only see wealth, but to those who can really see, they have become a disgrace. This is the heart of the Atlantis warning. The city does not collapse because it lacks resources. It collapses after abundance. That makes it more uncomfortable. Atlantis is not a poor society destroyed by weakness. It is a powerful society corrupted by success. It has land, food, metals, ships, kings, laws, temples, docks, and military organization. And still, it fails. This is why the story has more bite if we stop treating Atlantis only as a location mystery. The lost city may be less important than the diagnosis. Plato gives us a civilization that looks like the pinnacle of happiness from the outside, while its inner character is decaying. That is a better video than a fake coordinate. It is also much more disturbing. Near the end of Critias, Zeus sees the condition of Atlantis. The rulers are infected with unjust ambition and power. The civilization that looked magnificent has become morally disordered. Zeus decides they should meet with justice and be chastened. So he gathers the gods in their most hallowed dwelling place. Then he begins to speak, and the dialogue breaks off. That is one of the strangest things about Atlantis. The most famous lost city story in the Western imagination is unfinished. We have the setup, we have the origin, we have the geography, we have the rings, the metals, the fleet, the kings, the bull ritual, the corruption, and the divine judgment scene. But Plato never completes Critias. So the story ends with the gods assembled, judgment about to be announced, and the sentence missing. That unfinished ending made Atlantis even more powerful. It leaves space, and into that space later centuries poured maps, theories, oceans, islands, volcanoes, occult traditions, archaeology, fantasy, fraud, and obsession. But the missing ending also protects the deeper reading. Atlantis is not only a lost place, it is a warning interrupted at the exact moment judgment begins. The destruction line comes in Timaeus. After the war, there is a huge earthquake and deluge. In one grievous day and night, the Athenian warrior class is swallowed by the earth, and Atlantis sinks beneath the sea and disappears. That single phrase is why Atlantis became immortal. One day and night. A civilization gone. The sea left muddy and difficult to sail. It is easy to see why people connect this to real disasters. The ancient Mediterranean knew earthquakes. It knew floods. It knew volcanic destruction. The eruption of Thera, around the 2nd millennium BCE, has often been discussed as a possible distant memory behind parts of the Atlantis story, especially because it devastated the Aegean world and was connected with tsunamis. But the careful claim matters. Thera is not Atlantis. A volcanic eruption is not proof that Plato was preserving a precise map, and none of the famous proposed locations has produced a confirmed Atlantis. The stronger approach is different. Plato may be using the emotional memory of catastrophe to make a political and moral story feel ancient, enormous, and terrifying. That is why the destruction works. Atlantis does not merely lose a battle. It is erased. For centuries, people have tried to put Atlantis on a map. The Atlantic, the Azores, the Canary Islands, Spain, Santorini, the Sahara, the Americas. Almost every dramatic landscape has had its turn. Some proposals are interesting as cultural history. Some are careful hypotheses about how myths form around disasters. Others are pure clickbait. But the failure of the location hunt may be telling us something. Maybe Atlantis is hard to find because the original story was never only about finding. In Plato's text, Atlantis is built as a contrast. Athens is the disciplined city. Atlantis is the glittering imperial city. Athens resists domination. Atlantis tries to expand. Athens stands for order. Atlantis shows what happens when power outgrows virtue. That structure is too neat to ignore. The location hunt pulls the story outward into geography. The warning pulls it inward into politics. That does not mean there were no older memories behind the tale. Myths often borrow from real landscapes, real disasters, real wars, and real ruins. But the final shape we have is Plato's. And in Plato's hands, Atlantis becomes more useful as a mirror than as a destination. If you only ask where it was, you may miss what it was doing. The reason Atlantis still works is that it gives the viewer two opposite desires at once. We want it to be real, and we want it to be a warning for someone else. But Plato's story is uncomfortable because the warning is not only for an ancient island. A civilization can be rich and still be sick. It can be beautiful and still be unjust. It can build harbors, walls, temples, fleets, laws, and rituals, and still lose the thing that made it worth preserving. That is the underexplored Atlantis, not the lost paradise. Not the perfect city. Not the secret super-civilization waiting to be rediscovered. The Atlantis that Plato actually gives us is grander and darker, a ringed empire whose beauty hides ambition, whose kings bind themselves with blood, whose power reaches across the sea, whose wealth rots into arrogance, and whose ending is so total that later ages cannot stop searching for it. Maybe one day archaeologists will connect some part of the story to a real ancient disaster more convincingly than we can now. But even if no island is ever found, the warning remains. Atlantis was not just a city under the water. It was a civilization Plato wanted you to fear.